This is David Hawkins, DHI Enterprises, at The David Show on Instagram. And today I wanted to give my review of the Panasonic GX80 slash GX85 slash GX7 Mark II. It's the Identity Crisis Camera from Panasonic. And really, I spent about a week shooting with this camera for a client, and I basically shot about 5 or 6 hours on it every single day, so I became really familiar with it. So I wanted to give you the rundown, and I wanted to tell you what to expect compared to the G7 and compared to the GX8, and most importantly compared to the Sony A6300. Now the GX80 slash 85 slash GX7 Mark II is the successor to the GX7. They don't really consider the GX8 for some reason to be the true successor to the GX7. They consider the GX80 to be that, both in terms of price and where it's positioned to be in the market. And basically what you have is an upgraded 16 megapixel sensor. It's you get a bit more performance out of that than the sensor that was found in the GX7 or the G7. And they've also tweaked the processor a little bit, compared to the G7, for example. The G7 would allow you to have clean HDMI out at 4K if you wanted to connect it to a Shogun or something like that. But you couldn't really output 4K and record 4K internally at the same time. With this camera, with the GX80, you can. And also with the GX80, unlike the GX8, which featured 4-axis in-body stabilization, the GX80 actually has true 5-axis in-body stabilization, and it's not really the same kind that they have in some of the full-frame Sony cameras. It's actually a lot better. It's supposed to even be a step up for the best-in-class, Olympus level 5-axis stabilization, which was until now the best in-body stabilization that you could find in an interchangeable lens camera. So we're talking about a camera that you can take and hold in your hand and walk around with without any sort of a rig or a gimbal, and basically get very smooth video, much smoother than anything that you would find in the A6300, for example. Now, I do have a few qualms with this camera. I mean, the front dial on the GX80 is fine. The rear dial is really sort of flimsy and tiny, and it doesn't fit well to the thumb at all. Both of the dials on the G7 and the GX8 are much better than the ones that you're going to find on the GX80, and which brings me to the next big problem that I have with it, which is the grip. The grip is so tiny. It's very reminiscent of the original Sony A7 or something like that, where it's this very loose sort of grip, and you aren't going to feel very confident when you have a big lens attached to it. Like if you have a Canon adapter and you have that 24 to 105 L lens attached to it, there isn't so much for you to hold on to when you have heavier lenses. So really, when you have a camera like the GX80, 85, you're really looking at having smaller lenses on it, because it's going to be a lot better balanced for you, like the 12 to 32 millimeter kit lens that it comes with, or any of Panasonic's Micro Four Third lenses, which are much smaller and much lighter than some of the full frame lenses that you get from Canon or some of the full frame Sony lenses. So you're going to want to stick to lighter lenses with this particular camera until you have some sort of a shoulder rig or a gimbal that you can attach it to, which really sort of defeats the purpose in having a camera that's this small and this portable. The entire point is to have something that you can just walk around with. So it's really a shame that it doesn't have a sturdier grip that you could attach more things to. But that being said, what you do get is like rock solid, like stabilization performance. You've got something that you can hold on to and not only shoot video with, but you can shoot photos where normally there would be a lot of shake. For example, if you're using a zoom lens, like the equivalent of a 200 millimeter or something like that, and you're zoomed in all the way and the slightest movement would give you some blur, you could just go ahead and shoot that same picture at something as slow as 1/125th of a second, and you would get a really good image out of it. So that's something that I found incredible. But you know, where this camera really takes the cake is to have it and be able to walk around with it without any sort of gimbal, without any sort of like, you know, balancing equipment at all, and just be able to like, you know, have a really steady image. Because what it is it's got like a 3-axis stabilization in body, and you have like 2-axis stabilization coming from the lens. And so as you're walking around with it, it's balancing out, and it'll also balance any lens that you put on the camera, whether it has stabilization or not. So you would still get that sort of 3-axis stabilization from it. And you know, if you already have a gimbal, then I would imagine it would be even steadier, which isn't necessary. But you just have more options available to you now. So, you know, who is this camera for? You know, when we talk about who this camera is for, it really depends on the type of equipment that you're shooting with. Like I said, even though it has like the better processor and the better stabilization and everything, I really couldn't recommend this camera unless you have some sort of a rig that you can use to help hold this thing securely, because it's just, you don't have enough to hold on to when you have heavier lenses with the GX80. If that's the kind of equipment that you have, then I would be more likely to recommend the G7 over the GX80, just because it has the sturdier grip, and you can put 24 to 105 lenses on it, or a 70 to 200 lens on it without worrying about dropping the whole thing. So, you know, but if you have a lot of micro 4/3 lenses, if you have a bunch of Olympus and Panasonic lenses, and especially if you have lenses that are compatible with the dual IS system, and it's going to work well with this 5-axis stabilization, then I really can't see like recommending the G7 over the GX80, even though it's much cheaper than the GX80. Like, you know, I would go ahead and spend the extra money because you're getting a better processor, you're getting the ability to record internally to the memory card and record externally if you want. And, you know, it's a newer technology, you know, and the images are a little bit sharper, you get a little bit more dynamic range, and I would go ahead and spend the extra $100 or $200 and get the GX80 over the G7 if you're not shooting with large lenses. Now, finally, the big one is like, you know, should you choose this camera over the Sony A6300? Now, the thing to consider here is that one of the main complaints, two of the main complaints that people had about the A6300 is that it didn't have in-body stabilization, which, you know, Sony cameras already had, starting with the A7 II and the A7R II and the A7S II, and that it didn't have a touchscreen, which most Sony cameras don't have. This camera has both of those things. It has the best in-body stabilization in its class. It's the best stabilization that I've ever seen in a camera, period. You know, whether it was like a lens that had like in-lens stabilization, or I've also used all of the Sony bodies that have in-body stabilization, but this is a completely different league. We're talking about you walking down the street at normal speed and not being able to see the camera shake at all. So it has the in-body stabilization and it has a touch screen. So in terms of focusing, you can sort of point to focus as you're moving if you're shooting with like a autofocus. So, and there's just a million more things you can do with the touchscreen. It makes navigating the menus easier. It makes it easier to pull up your settings. So for the price, I think that, you know, while it's nice to have S-Log2 and S-Log3 and all that, and you know, you do get more detail with the A6300, but I think for the price, you know, for me, in-body stabilization far outweighs, the little bit of extra detail that you would get with the Sony a6300. If we were talking about some gigantic amount of detail, if we were talking about actual 6K and that 6K downscale to 4K, if we were talking about 4K 60p as opposed to 4K 24p and 30p, then yeah, the a6300 would make a lot more sense. But just given like the small amount of detail that you're going to get like from the a6300 increased over the GX80, then I wouldn't recommend it for that reason alone. Now, what I would recommend the a6300 for over the GX80 is photography. Because basically you're talking about 400 and something points of phase detect autofocus compared to the contrast only autofocus of the GX80. So it's a lot faster, it's a lot more accurate. Even in video, it's faster and more accurate than the GX80. So, but for photography, it's a much better camera. It's APS-C compared to Micro Four Thirds. It's 24 megapixels compared to 16 megapixels. And it focuses a lot better with Canon lenses on an adapter than the GX80 would ever do. So for photography, if you're mainly a photographer who sometimes shoots video, then I would have to recommend the Sony a6300. If your primary purpose is shooting video, regardless of what kind of videographer you are, I can't imagine that anything would be able to trump the 5-axis stabilization in this camera, unless you already own a really fancy gimbal that would cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of €1,000 or $1,000 anyway. But for strictly video, I would absolutely go with the GX80 unless you're shooting with larger lenses. Because even with the Sony a6300, I prefer their grip and the way that Canon lenses feel on that camera than the way that they feel on the GX80. So that about wraps it up for this. I'm going to shoot a longer full stop video on this camera and give you some actual examples and sample video and all that. So stay tuned to this channel and subscribe and like I said, we're here every Tuesday. This has been David Hawkins at The David Show on Instagram, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks for watching. Maybe you want to take away the 30-minute limit from your video, or check out one of my new videos down here. But above all, please click the red subscribe button below. That's going to let you see all of my latest shows as soon as they come out. Again, this has been David Hawkins. Follow me on Instagram at The David Show. Catch you later.